In the spring of 1943, along the coasts of Western Europe, an extraordinary transformation was taking place. From the fjords of Norway to the beaches of Spain, across 2,400 miles of coastline, Nazi Germany was constructing the most ambitious defensive system ever conceived. They called it the Atlantic Wall. 500,000 concrete and steel obstacles, 6.5 million mines, bunkers positioned every few hundred yards, each one designed to pour fire onto any beach where invaders might land. It was meant to be impregnable, a fortress that would make invasion impossible. And yet, within 18 months, this colossal barrier would be rendered nearly useless not by bombs or battleships, but by something far more unexpected. This is the story of how imagination defeated concrete, how creativity triumphed over steel, and how the greatest military deception in history turned Germany's mightiest defense into a monument to wasted effort. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Picture, if you will, the underground war rooms beneath Whitehall in London. The year is 1943, and the air is thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of impossible decisions. Around a table covered in maps and intelligence reports, British and American military planners are confronting a problem that seems to have no solution. They must invade occupied Europe. There is simply no other way to defeat Nazi Germany. But the numbers before them tell a story of potential catastrophe. The Atlantic Wall has consumed 10% of Germany's entire war economy. More concrete has been poured into its construction than was used to build every German highway combined. The bunkers are reinforced with steel and positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Behind the coastal defences, mobile, panzer divisions wait to counterattack any landing force. German engineering has created a killing zone so efficient that initial casualty projections are almost incomprehensible. 750,000 Allied lives in the first week alone. Perhaps more. Consider for a moment what that number means. 750,000 sons, fathers, brothers gone in 7 days, entire divisions destroyed before they could advance beyond the beaches. The planners understood that even if such losses were militarily acceptable, which they were not, the political and moral cost would be unbearable. The Western democracies could not sustain such carnage. And yet, invasion was not optional. It was necessary. Into this seemingly impossible situation stepped a man whose previous career had been marked by spectacular failure. Juan Pujol Garcia had tried to be a hotel manager and failed. He had attempted to run a chicken farm, which also failed. He had written a novel that no publisher would touch. But Juan Pujol possessed something that turned out to be far more valuable than conventional success. He had an extraordinary imagination and an unshakable hatred of fascism. In 1941, Pujol had approached the British with an audacious proposal. He would become a German spy. Not a real one, of course. He would create an entirely fictional spy network, feed the Germans false information, and earn their complete trust. The British initially rejected him. The idea seemed too fantastical, too risky. So Pujol did something remarkable. He convinced the Germans to recruit him first. Operating from Lisbon with nothing but a guidebook to England and tremendous nerve, he began sending reports to German intelligence about British military activities. He had never set foot in Britain. Every detail was invented, and the Germans believed every word. His reports were so convincing that British counterintelligence noticed German intelligence acting on information about British activities that never happened. When they traced the source, they discovered this failed Spanish novelist had single-handedly created the most successful deception operation of the war without any training or support. The British immediately brought him to London, gave him the codename Garbo, and turned his one-man operation into something far more ambitious. By 1943, Garbo's fictional spy network had grown to include 27 imaginary sub-agents. Each had a detailed backstory. Each had distinct writing patterns and personality quirks. There was the Swiss businessman who travelled frequently, the Venezuelan student studying at Glasgow University, the Welsh nationalist who despised the English, the widow in Liverpool who worked in an ammunition factory. None of them existed, but in German intelligence files, they were real people providing valuable intelligence. Garbo himself never left London, yet his agents reported from every corner of Britain. He sent an average of 10 messages per day to his German handlers. By the time D-Day arrived, he had transmitted 7,900 individual reports. Each one was carefully crafted to build a picture of Allied strength and intentions that was fundamentally false. And the Germans paid him for it. They awarded him the Iron Cross. He was their most trusted source. But Garbo was not working alone. What began as one man's audacious gambit had evolved into something far more sophisticated. The British had discovered something extraordinary. They had captured or turned every single German agent in Britain. All 27 of them, not most of them, not nearly all, every single one. Some had been arrested and offered the choice of cooperation or execution. Others had voluntarily turned themselves in, never having believed in the Nazi cause. A few had been German intelligence officers who were secretly working against Hitler. But regardless of how it happened, by 1943, British intelligence controlled the entire German spy network in Britain. This created an unprecedented opportunity. The British could not only feed false information to Germany, they could read German reactions through decoded Enigma intercepts and adjust their lies accordingly. They called this the double-cross system, and it was overseen by a committee that met every Thursday at 58 St. James Street. The 20 Committee, they called it, a play on the Roman numerals XX for double-cross. These weekly meetings would become the nerve centre of the most elaborate deception ever attempted. The challenge they faced was both simple and impossibly complex. The Allies were going to invade France. That much was certain. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They were preparing for it. The Atlantic Wall itself was evidence of that preparation. But the coastline of Western Europe offered many possible landing sites. The Germans could not strongly defend everywhere. They had to concentrate their forces where the invasion would actually occur. So the question became, could the Allies make them defend the wrong place? The most obvious target was Calais. It was the shortest distance from England to France, just 21 miles across the Strait of Dover. The terrain beyond the beaches was relatively favourable for armoured warfare. Most importantly, Calais offered the most direct route to Germany itself. Any military planner looking at a map would identify it as the logical choice. The Germans certainly did. They had concentrated their strongest defences there, including the 15th Army, their most powerful force in France. But Calais was obvious precisely because it was logical. The Allied planners chose Normandy instead. The beaches were less ideal, the distance greater, the route to Germany more indirect. But Normandy offered surprise and, if the deception worked, the opportunity to land and establish a beachhead before German reinforcements could arrive. The entire success of the invasion depended on one crucial factor. The Germans had to continue believing the real attack would come at Calais, even after Allied forces landed in Normandy. This was not a deception that could be maintained through whispers and rumours. It required something unprecedented in scale and ambition. The Allies would have to create an entire phantom army, make it seem so real and so threatening that German intelligence would report its existence with complete confidence, and maintain the illusion not just until D-Day, but for weeks afterward. The Atlantic Wall would not be defeated by breaking through it, but by making the Germans defend the wrong section of it. In February of 1944, the plan received its official code name, Operation Bodyguard. The name came from a Churchill quote, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." That bodyguard would need to be immense. Every detail had to be perfect. Every fake radio transmission, every inflatable tank, every false supply requisition had to create a consistent picture. German intelligence would be looking for inconsistencies, for signs of deception. A single mistake could unravel everything. The magnitude of what they were attempting becomes clear when you consider what they were asking the enemy to believe. The Allies would have to convince Germany that an invasion force of over 1 million men was gathering in southeast England, directly across from Calais. This force would need supply depots, fuel dumps, ammunition stores, headquarters buildings, field hospitals, and all the infrastructure of a massive military operation. It would need a command structure, with a believable commander. It would need to conduct training exercises, hold briefings, send radio traffic, and generate all the electromagnetic signatures that German listening posts would expect to detect. And all of it would have to be fake. The man chosen to command this phantom army was General George Patton, and that choice was itself a stroke of genius. Patton was the most aggressive and, to German thinking, the most dangerous Allied general. He had commanded with spectacular success in North Africa and Sicily. German intelligence considered him the Allies' finest field commander. If the invasion was coming, they reasoned, Patton would lead it. So the Allies gave Patton command of the 1st United States Army Group, positioned him in southeast England, and let German intelligence draw the obvious conclusion. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG as it was called, existed only on paper and in German imagination. But over the next 4 months, it would become the most important military force that never was. Everything the Allies did to build this phantom army, they did with the knowledge that German intelligence was watching. In fact, they were counting on it. Every fake installation, every rubber tank, every scripted radio message was a piece of bait, carefully designed to be discovered by German reconnaissance. The theatrical nature of the operation required Hollywood expertise. The Allies recruited set designers from film studios, artists from advertising agencies, sound engineers from radio production. These civilians would work alongside military engineers to create props of war. But unlike movie sets that only needed to convince cameras, these props had to fool German reconnaissance aircraft flying at 5,000 feet and photo analysts examining images with magnifying glasses. The inflatable tanks they created were masterpieces of practical deception. Made of rubberized canvas and supported by air pumps, each one could be compressed to fit into a duffel bag. 2 men could deploy a complete tank in 15 minutes, inflating it until it had the exact dimensions and silhouette of a real Sherman tank. From the ground, up close, the illusion was obvious. But from the air, through the lens of a reconnaissance camera, they were indistinguishable from genuine armor. The Allies deployed 30,000 of these inflatable vehicles across southeast England. But visual deception alone was not enough. German listening posts monitored radio traffic, analyzing the patterns and volume of transmissions to estimate Allied strength and locations. Every military unit has a distinctive electromagnetic signature. Tank battalions generate different radio traffic than infantry divisions. Headquarters units send different types of messages than supply depots. The Allies had to recreate all of these patterns artificially. Radio operators worked 18-hour shifts, each one trained to mimic the Morse code fist of specific military units. Every radio operator has a distinctive rhythm and style when sending Morse code, as recognizable as a signature. The deception required operators who could impersonate other operators convincingly enough to fool German analysts who had been tracking those signatures for months. They sent 40,000 fake messages, each one contributing to the illusion of a massive army preparing for invasion. The messages themselves were carefully crafted to seem mundane. They discussed supply requisitions, leave requests, equipment maintenance, training schedules, all the routine communications of military life. But cumulatively, they created a picture of immense activity. German analysts, comparing intercepts from different listening posts, would conclude that a force of extraordinary size was assembling in exactly the location the Allies wanted them to see it. Sound was another crucial element. The Allies recorded actual tank battalions during training exercises, capturing the distinctive roar of hundreds of engines, the clank of treads on roads, the sounds of a mechanized army on the move. These recordings were then played back through speaker systems, positioned near the fake encampments. The speakers were powerful enough to be heard 15 miles away, and German agents were known to be operating in areas where they could hear these phantom armies preparing for battle. Every sense had to be deceived. Inflatable tanks for sight, radio traffic for electromagnetic detection, sound systems for hearing. Even supply convoys were staged, with real trucks moving fake supplies to non-existent units, because German agents watching British roads needed to see the logistics of invasion being assembled. The Atlantic Wall was formidable, but it was defended by human beings who gathered information through human senses and processed it through human reasoning. The deception targeted not the concrete bunkers, but the minds of the German commanders who would decide where to position their forces. By May of 1944, as the actual invasion date approached, the Phantom 1st United States Army Group had become, in German intelligence assessments, the most dangerous Allied force in Britain. They estimated its strength at over 1 million men, with enough armour and artillery to devastate any defence. German commanders at Calais requested reinforcements, convinced they would face the main assault. The Atlantic Wall's strongest defences waited for Patton's Phantom Army, while the real invasion force assembled 200 miles to the west, preparing to land on beaches the Germans considered a secondary threat. The impossible wall still stood, its concrete as thick, its mines as deadly, its guns as powerful as the day they were installed. But the deception had already achieved what no amount of explosives could accomplish. It had turned Germany's greatest defensive asset into a liability, concentrating their forces to repel an attack that would never come while leaving the actual invasion beaches comparatively vulnerable. The wall had not been broken, it had been bypassed through imagination, rendered irrelevant through creativity, defeated before the first Allied soldier set foot on French soil. In those final days before D-Day, as real invasion forces gathered in southwest England, the greatest magic trick in military history was reaching its climax. Thousands of inflatable tanks, hundreds of fake landing craft, millions of false radio messages, all of it building toward a single moment when German commanders would have to decide where would the invasion come. And when it came at Normandy instead of Calais, would they recognize it as the real attack, or would they believe what the Phantom armies had taught them to believe, that Normandy itself was the deception, that Patton's invisible force was still coming, that the Atlantic Wall's strongest defences were positioned exactly where they needed to be? The answer to those questions would determine whether the Atlantic Wall would become Hitler's impregnable fortress or his most expensive failure. And that answer would be written not in concrete and steel, but in the imagination of German intelligence officers who had learned to trust lies more than truth, who had been taught by Garbo and his fellow deceivers to see armies that existed only as rubber and radio waves, who were about to discover that the impossible wall had been defeated by the one weapon no amount of engineering could defend against, a story they desperately wanted to believe. Across the fields and villages of southeast England in the spring of 1944, something extraordinary was taking shape. In meadows where sheep had grazed for centuries, rows of tanks now stood in military formation. Along country roads, convoys of trucks moved supplies to encampments that sprawled across the landscape. In harbours and inlets, landing craft clustered in such numbers that the water itself seemed to disappear beneath them. From every vantage point, the signs of invasion were unmistakable. An army of staggering size was gathering, preparing for the greatest amphibious assault in history. There was only one problem. Almost none of it was real. The transformation of England's southeast into a staging ground for phantom forces required an unprecedented collaboration between artists and soldiers, between imagination and engineering. Hollywood set designers who had created alien landscapes for science fiction films now designed fake military installations. London theatre crews who had built elaborate stage sets now constructed dummy headquarters buildings. Sound engineers from the BBC worked alongside signals intelligence officers to create the acoustic signatures of armoured divisions. What emerged was neither pure theatre nor pure warfare, but something entirely new: military deception as a form of total art. Consider the challenge they faced. A real tank battalion generates dozens of observable signatures. There is the visual presence of the vehicles themselves, naturally, but that is only the beginning. There are the tracks the tanks leave in mud and grass, the compressed earth where they have been parked, the fuel trucks that service them, the maintenance crews that repair them, the radio traffic between tank commanders, the heat signatures when engines run, the noise when they move, the supply chains that feed them ammunition and spare parts. Every one of these elements had to be recreated convincingly because German intelligence was not looking at any single piece of evidence. They were assembling a mosaic from hundreds of observations, and every tile in that mosaic had to fit perfectly. The inflatable tanks became the most visible symbol of the deception, but they were far more sophisticated than simple balloons shaped like vehicles. Each one was constructed with precise attention to detail. The turrets rotated, the gun barrels could be elevated or depressed, the tracks had the correct tread pattern. Even the unit markings and identification numbers were carefully painted to match real military conventions. These were not crude mock-ups. They were perfect replicas in every detail that could be observed from the air. The logistics of deploying 30,000 fake vehicles across hundreds of square miles required military precision. Each inflatable tank was assigned to a specific unit, positioned according to actual tactical doctrine, and maintained by crews who moved them periodically to simulate normal military activity. German reconnaissance flights would photograph an encampment one day, then return a week later to find the tanks had been repositioned, exactly as real units would relocate during training exercises. The illusion extended across time as well as space, but perhaps most remarkably, the teams creating these phantom armies understood that perfection itself could be suspicious. Real military encampments are never perfect. Equipment breaks down, vehicles are sometimes parked haphazardly, camouflage discipline occasionally fails, so the deception teams deliberately introduced flaws. A few tanks would be positioned carelessly, as if someone had been lazy. Occasionally, a piece of equipment would be left partially uncovered, visible from the air. These calculated mistakes made the phantom armies more believable than flawless replicas ever could have been. The wooden aircraft that filled airfields across southeast England demonstrated the same attention to realistic imperfection. Constructed from plywood and canvas, these fake planes required only a few hours to build but looked absolutely authentic from altitude. They were positioned on airstrips with proper spacing, rotated periodically to simulate maintenance schedules, and occasionally moved to different locations as real squadrons would redeploy. Some were even deliberately damaged, with simulated repair work visible from above, because German photo analysts would expect to see some casualties from training accidents or mechanical failures. The scale of this false air force was breathtaking. Entire airfields that had been empty in March were filled with aircraft by May. German intelligence, counting planes in reconnaissance, photographs, calculated Allied air superiority as far greater than it actually was. This was not merely aesthetic deception. It had strategic consequences. German commanders, believing the Allies could deploy overwhelming air power at Calais, concentrated their anti-aircraft defences there, leaving Normandy comparatively vulnerable. Now imagine the challenge of creating fake landing craft. Unlike tanks that could sit in fields or planes that occupied airfields, landing craft had to float in actual water, move with tides, and withstand weather. The solution was ingenious. Engineers constructed frames from wood and canvas that floated on empty oil drums. From the shore, they looked obviously fake. But from 5,000 feet, through the lens of a reconnaissance camera, they were indistinguishable from genuine landing craft. Harbours along England's southeast coast filled with hundreds of these fake vessels, creating the appearance of enormous amphibious capability, positioned exactly where it would be needed for a Calais invasion. The recording trucks that moved through the countryside represented another dimension of the deception entirely. These vehicles carried sophisticated equipment that could capture the acoustic signature of real military operations, then play them back at high volume. A single recording of an actual tank battalion moving through training maneuvers could be replayed to simulate that same battalion moving past multiple German listening posts. The sounds were so precise that analysts could identify specific vehicle types by their engine notes and estimate unit strength by the volume and duration of the recordings. These sound systems operated primarily at night, when German agents were most likely to be listening and when the sounds would carry furthest. Imagine being a German intelligence officer in occupied France, hearing across the channel the unmistakable roar of hundreds of tank engines, the rumble of artillery being moved into position, the organized chaos of a mechanized army preparing for war. You would report what you heard, confident in your observations, never imagining that you were listening to a recording played through speakers powerful enough to project 15 miles across open water. The radio deception operated on an even more sophisticated level. Every military unit generates a characteristic pattern of radio traffic. Division headquarters send different types of messages than regimental command posts. Tank battalions communicate more frequently than infantry companies. Supply units use different frequencies than combat units. German signals intelligence had spent years cataloguing these patterns, building profiles of how Allied forces communicated. The phantom armies had to recreate these patterns perfectly. The radio operators assigned to this deception worked shifts that would have broken less dedicated personnel. 18 hours per day, they sat at transmitters, sending messages in the Morse code fist of operators they were impersonating. Each operator has a distinctive rhythm, speed, and style when tapping out Morse code. It is as individual as a fingerprint. The deception operators had to learn not just the content of military communications, but the personal style of specific radio operators whose transmissions German analysts had been tracking for months. They sent 40,000 fake messages over the course of the operation. Each one had to be militarily plausible, appropriate to the supposed unit sending it, and consistent with previous messages from that unit. A supply officer requesting fuel had to request amounts consistent with the unit's size. A training schedule had to account for weather conditions on the day it was supposedly sent. Leave requests had to follow proper military procedures. Every detail mattered, because German intelligence officers were looking for exactly these kinds of inconsistencies. The 20 Committee orchestrated this vast symphony of deception from their Thursday meetings at 58 St. James Street. Each week, they reviewed what German intelligence believed, what new information needed to be provided, and how to maintain consistency across all the deception channels. They were conducting what might be called warfare by narrative, creating a story so detailed and so consistent that it became more believable than reality. The double agents played their roles with extraordinary dedication. Garbo alone managed his network of 27 fictional sub-agents, each with their own communication style and reporting patterns. The Venezuelan student supposedly studying at Glasgow University sent reports about ship movements in Scottish ports. The Welsh nationalist provided information about troop concentrations in Wales. The widow working at a Liverpool ammunition factory reported on production schedules. None of these people existed, but in German files they were real sources who had proven reliable over years of reporting. Other double agents contributed their own pieces to the puzzle. Agent Brutus, a Polish officer genuinely working for the Allies, reported on the phantom FUSAG units he supposedly observed during his official duties. Agent Tricycle, a Yugoslav playboy whom the Germans trusted, provided confirmation of Patton's command appointment and the massive build-up in southeast England. Each agent's reports corroborated the others, creating a web of evidence that seemed to come from completely independent sources. The Germans never suspected that every single source was controlled by the same British intelligence service. The genius of this system lay in its use of confirmation bias. Human beings naturally look for information that confirms what they already believe. The Germans believed Calais was the logical invasion target. Every report from the double agents reinforced that belief. They wanted to believe Patton commanded the invasion force, because that matched their assessment of Allied strategy. Every piece of fake intelligence confirmed their expectations. The deception worked not by changing German minds, but by telling them what they already thought they knew. By late May of 1944, the phantom 1st United States Army Group had achieved a kind of reality in German consciousness that transcended mere deception. Intelligence officers in Berlin studied reports about Fusag's strength, debated its readiness, analyzed its probable tactics. They worried about its air support, estimated its amphibious capacity, calculated how many days after landing it could break out from the beaches. They were conducting serious military analysis of an army that existed only as inflated rubber, wooden frames, radio transmissions, and lies. The actual invasion forces, meanwhile, assembled in southwest England in conditions of extraordinary secrecy. The real armoured divisions, the genuine landing craft, the actual air squadrons all concentrated around Portsmouth and Southampton, 200 miles from where German intelligence expected them. These forces practiced amphibious assaults, loaded supplies, briefed soldiers on their missions, all while maintaining radio silence and strict camouflage discipline. The contrast was remarkable. The fake armies broadcast their presence as loudly as possible. The real armies hid. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, visited the phantom installations periodically, always aware that German agents might be watching. His visits to the fake headquarters in southeast England were publicized. His visits to the real invasion forces in southwest England were kept absolutely secret. Even this detail contributed to the deception. Where the commander goes, German intelligence reasoned, there the important forces must be gathering. As June approached, the scale of what had been accomplished became clear in ways both intended and unexpected. The Germans believed the Allies had assembled 510 divisions in Britain. The actual number was 350. The phantom armies had convinced German intelligence that Allied strength was 45% greater than reality. This was not a minor miscalculation. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of Allied capability that would shape every German decision about how to defend against invasion. More importantly, the Germans had positioned their forces based on these false assessments. The 15th Army at Calais, their strongest force in France, waited for Patton's phantom legions. The 7th Army in Normandy, which would actually face the invasion, was considered a secondary defence force adequate for repelling a diversionary attack. The Atlantic Wall's most powerful defences guarded against a threat that existed only in German imagination, while the real invasion force prepared to land where defences were weakest. The deception teams understood that their work would not end when the first Allied soldier landed on French soil. In fact, the most critical phase would come after D-Day. The Germans had to continue believing that Normandy was a feint, that the real invasion was still coming at Calais, that Patton's forces were still waiting in England for their moment to strike. If German commanders realized too quickly that Normandy was the main effort, they would shift reinforcements from Calais, and the entire deception would fail at the moment of its greatest importance. So preparations were made to extend the illusion beyond the invasion itself. The phantom armies would have to explain why they were not attacking yet. Weather delays, supply problems, political disagreements, any plausible excuse would be used. Garbo and the other double agents prepared to send urgent messages after D-Day, confirming that yes, Normandy was the diversion, the real attack was imminent. German forces must remain at Calais. The bodyguard of lies would have to protect the truth not just until invasion, but for weeks. Afterward, on the eve of D-Day, the phantom armies of southeast England stood ready as forces that do not exist can be. 30,000 inflatable tanks waited in fields, wooden aircraft filled airstrips, fake landing craft clustered in harbours, radio operators prepared to send messages about the imminent invasion that would never come. Garbo crafted his most important reports, the ones he would send in the days after the real landing, the lies that would have to be so convincing that German commanders would believe them, even as Allied forces stormed ashore 200 miles from where those commanders expected. The Atlantic Wall still stood, its concrete thick, its guns ready, its defenders waiting. But the wall was now defending the wrong place, its strength concentrated where the enemy would not come, its reserves held back for a phantom army that existed only in the minds of German intelligence officers who had been taught, through patience and artistry and obsessive attention to detail, to believe in ghosts. The impossible wall had been defeated not by breaking through it, but by making those who defended it look the wrong way, by winning a battle that would never be fought against an army that was never there. In the entire history of espionage, no intelligence service has ever achieved what British MI5 accomplished between 1940 and 1943. They captured or turned every single German agent operating in Britain. Not most of them, not the majority, every one. 27 in total. This was not luck. It was the result of systematic counterintelligence work that represented something genuinely new in the ancient craft of spying. Some of the German agents were arrested the moment they arrived. Britain's coast watchers and police forces had been trained to look for suspicious activity, and the Germans had not trained their agents particularly well. Several landed by parachute and were captured within hours, still carrying their remains, radio equipment and German money. Others arrived by boat and were picked up trying to make contact with handlers who had already been arrested. A few simply walked into police stations and surrendered, having never believed in the Nazi cause they were supposedly serving. But capture was only the first step. Each arrested agent was offered a choice: cooperate with British intelligence or face execution as a spy. Most chose cooperation. A few were executed, their deaths kept secret, so the Germans would continue believing these agents were operational. The executions served a purpose beyond punishment. They sent a clear message to the remaining agents about the consequences of refusing to cooperate. The captured agents who agreed to work for Britain became something unprecedented. Double agents controlled so completely that they became, in effect, extensions of British intelligence itself. They lived under constant supervision. Their every movement was monitored. Their radio transmissions were composed by MI5 officers. Their meetings with German handlers were staged events where every word was scripted. They had become puppets, and British intelligence held all the strings. Agent Garbo, whom we have already met, was the most successful, but he was far from alone. Agent Tricycle, whose real name was Dusko Popov, was a Yugoslav businessman who had been recruited by German intelligence before the war. He was charming, sophisticated, and moved easily in high society. The Germans trusted him implicitly. What they did not know was that he had approached British intelligence immediately upon arriving in England, offering his services to the Allies. For 4 years he fed carefully crafted misinformation to his German handlers, while living a lifestyle that convinced them he was everything they believed him to be. Agent Brutus, a Polish Air Force officer named Roman Garby-Czerniawski, had been genuinely working for German intelligence in France before he was captured by Garby-Czerniaw, the Gestapo. The Germans thought they had recruited him through a combination of threats and inducements. What they did not know was that Polish intelligence had already turned him, and when he was sent to Britain, he immediately made contact with MI5. His reports about Allied air forces were particularly valued by the Germans because of his authentic military background. Every word was fiction approved by British intelligence. Then there was Agent Treasure, a French woman named Lily Sergeev, who kept a detailed diary throughout her time as a double agent. Her writings provide an extraordinary window into the psychological strain of living a completely fabricated life. She was sending her German handlers information that she knew was false, maintaining relationships that were entirely artificial, all while knowing that any mistake could mean her death. Her diary reveals someone constantly terrified of making an error that would expose the deception, yet continuing to perform her role with remarkable discipline. The coordination required to manage these double agents was staggering. Every piece of information sent by one agent had to be consistent with information sent by others. If Agent Tricycle reported seeing a tank division in one location, and Agent Garbo's subagents reported the same division in a different location, German intelligence would immediately suspect deception. The stories had to interlock perfectly, like pieces of a vast puzzle assembled by many hands working in complete coordination. This coordination was the responsibility of the 20 Committee, named for the double cross represented by the Roman numerals XX. Every Thursday, the committee met at 58 St. James Street in London. The meetings brought together representatives from MI5, MI6, military intelligence, and the Special Operations Executive. They reviewed what each double agent had reported in the previous week, what German responses had been intercepted through Ultra, decryption of Enigma messages, and what new information needed to be fed to the Germans. The chairman of the 20 Committee was J.C. Masterman, an Oxford don whose background in academic logic proved perfectly suited to the intricate chess game of deception. He understood that the committee was not simply managing individual agents, but constructing an entire alternate reality in German consciousness. Each meeting involved decisions about plot lines in this ongoing narrative. Which units should agents report seeing? What shipping movements should be mentioned? What rumors about Allied plans should be allowed to circulate? Every detail had to advance the larger story, while maintaining absolute consistency. The committee members knew something that gave their work unprecedented power. Through the Ultra program, British codebreakers had broken the German Enigma cipher. This meant they could read German military and intelligence communications in near real time. More importantly for the deception operation, they could read German intelligence assessments of the information being provided by the double agents. They could see what the Germans believed, what they doubted, what they desperately wanted to know. This created a feedback loop unlike anything in the history of intelligence work. The 20 Committee would decide what information to feed the Germans through the double agents. Days later, they would read German intelligence reports discussing that information, analyzing it, incorporating it into their assessment of Allied capabilities. If the Germans showed doubt about certain claims, the committee would have other double agents provide corroborating details. If the Germans seemed to accept information too easily, the committee would introduce complications to make the intelligence seem more hard-won and therefore more credible. Imagine the power this represented. You are playing a card game where you can see your opponent's hand. You are writing a novel where you can read your reader's thoughts about each chapter. You are conducting an orchestra where you can hear how the audience will respond before the performance begins. The 20 Committee could test their deceptions in real time and adjust based on German reactions. They were not simply lying to the enemy. They were conducting psychological experiments, testing theories about how intelligence organizations process information and refining their techniques based on measured results. The double agents sent carefully calibrated mixtures of truth and lies. This ratio was crucial. Pure fabrication would eventually be detected. But if 70% of the information was accurate and verifiable, the 30% that was false would be accepted as equally reliable. Agent Garbo, for instance, would report troop movements that were real but irrelevant, ship sailings that were genuine but routine, and then slip in completely false information about invasion preparations. The Germans, having verified the true information, would believe the false information came from the same reliable source. The agents also had to maintain their cover stories through years of operation. Agent Tricycle's persona as a playboy businessman required him to actually live that lifestyle. He frequented expensive restaurants, maintained romantic relationships, traveled constantly, all while German intelligence watched to ensure he was the person he claimed to be. His actual intelligence work was hidden inside the life of apparent frivolity. The Germans never suspected that the charming wastrel spending their money in London nightclubs was actually one of the most important Allied intelligence assets. Some agents ran their networks for so long that they developed genuine relationships with their German handlers. They learned their handlers' personalities, their fears, their ambitions. This knowledge became another tool of manipulation. If an agent knew his handler was ambitious and eager to provide Berlin with impressive intelligence, the agent could frame information in ways that appealed to that ambition. If a handler was cautious and skeptical, the agent would be more restrained, building credibility slowly. The psychology of deception extended not just to the information itself, but to the relationship through which it was transmitted. By early 1944, as the invasion approached, the double-cross system had achieved something remarkable. German intelligence's entire picture of Allied strength, dispositions, and intentions came from sources controlled by British intelligence. The Germans were not merely receiving false information, they were receiving carefully constructed false information that confirmed their existing beliefs, that came from sources they had validated through years of operation, and that was corroborated by multiple independent channels that were actually the same channel presenting different faces. The scope of what had been accomplished becomes clear when you consider that German intelligence in Britain was not receiving any accurate information about Allied invasion plans. None. Every report came from double agents. Every observation came from controlled sources. The Germans had been rendered effectively blind, replaced their vision with an artificial picture so detailed and so consistent that they never realized they were seeing a fabrication. The 20 committee's records show they understood the magnitude of their achievement. In one meeting's minutes, an intelligence officer noted that they had created a situation unique in intelligence history, in which we controlled the enemy's entire intelligence picture of our most important military operations. Another member observed that they were conducting warfare by narrative, where victory would be achieved not through bullets but through the stories we told. As D-Day approached, the double agents prepared for their most critical performance. Once the invasion began, they would have to explain why the landing at Normandy was not the main attack. They would have to maintain German belief in the phantom armies for weeks after real Allied forces had landed on French soil. The web they had woven over 4 years would have to hold under the greatest strain it would ever face. 27 German agents who did not exist, controlled by British intelligence officers who had become the most successful liars in history, would determine whether the Atlantic Wall's defenders would recognize the real invasion or continue believing in ghosts. In the history of warfare, there has never been a weapon quite like Ultra. It was not a bomb or a bullet. It was knowledge. The ability to read your enemy's most secret communications in real time, to know not just what they were doing, but what they were thinking, what they believed, what they feared. And in the context of Operation Bodyguard, Ultra became something even more powerful, a mirror that showed the Allies exactly how their deceptions were being received, allowing them to refine their lies with scientific precision. The story of Ultra begins at Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion 50 miles north of London that became the unlikely centre of the greatest cryptographic achievement of the war. Here, mathematicians, linguists, and engineers worked in absolute secrecy to break the German Enigma cipher. The Enigma machine was extraordinarily sophisticated, generating millions of possible cipher combinations that changed daily. The Germans believed it was unbreakable. They were wrong. By 1943, Bletchley Park was decrypting thousands of German messages every day. Military orders, intelligence reports, logistical communications, all flowing through the facility where analysts translated them, prioritized them, and distributed them to commanders who needed the information. But perhaps the most valuable intercepts were not military orders at all. They were intelligence assessments from German headquarters, discussing what they believed about Allied strength and intentions. These assessments revealed something extraordinary. The Germans were discussing the double agents' reports as if they were absolutely reliable intelligence. Agent Garbo's network was mentioned by name in high-level German communications. His reports were being circulated to field commanders, incorporated into strategic planning, treated as some of the most valuable intelligence Germany possessed. The British could see, in the Germans' own words, that the deception was working, but Ultra provided something far more powerful than simple confirmation. It showed the Allies exactly where their deceptions were weak, where German intelligence had doubts, where the story needed reinforcement. This created what intelligence officers began calling the feedback machine, a system where deception could be tested and refined in an endless cycle of improvement. Consider how this worked in practice. The 20 Committee would decide that Agent Tricycle should report seeing a new tank division arriving at a port in southeast England. Tricycle would send this information to his German handler. Within days, sometimes within hours, Bletchley Park would decrypt German intelligence communications discussing this report. The decrypted messages would show whether the Germans believed it, whether they had questions, whether they wanted confirmation from other sources. If the Germans accepted the report without question, the 20 Committee knew they could be even bolder with future deceptions. If the Germans showed skepticism, they would immediately dispatch other double agents to provide corroborating details. Agent Brutus might report overhearing discussions about that same division. One of Garbo's sub-agents might claim to have seen the division's vehicles being unloaded. The Germans, comparing reports from supposedly independent sources, would see their doubts resolved through multiple confirmations. This feedback process operated at extraordinary speed. The gap between a double agent sending information and the 20 Committee reading German responses was sometimes less than 24 hours. Modern military analysts have compared it to a machine learning algorithm, constantly testing hypotheses, measuring results, and adjusting based on feedback. But this was 1944, decades before computers could perform such analysis. The feedback machine was powered by human intelligence and cryptographic brilliance. The mathematical precision that emerged from this process was remarkable. British analysts discovered that Germans required information to be confirmed by an average of 2.3 independent sources before they would incorporate it into operational planning. One source was interesting, 2 sources were convincing, 3 sources were definitive. The 20 Committee used this knowledge to orchestrate their double agents like instruments in a symphony, having each one contribute their part at precisely the right moment to achieve maximum credibility. They also learned that Germans were more likely to believe intelligence that required effort to obtain. Information that came too easily was suspect. So the double agents were instructed to occasionally fail in their intelligence gathering, to report that certain information could not be confirmed, to admit when they did not know something. These displays of limitation actually increased the credibility of the information they did provide. A spy who admits ignorance about some things is believed when he claims knowledge about others. The feedback revealed German assumptions that could be exploited. The Germans believed Patton was the Allies' finest commander, so they accepted that he would lead the invasion. They believed Calais was the logical target, so they interpreted ambiguous information as confirming that belief. They believed the Allies would not invade until they had overwhelming force, so they accepted inflated estimates of Allied strength. Every German preconception became a vulnerability that the deception could exploit. Ultra also showed when the Germans were getting close to the truth. In April of 1944, German intelligence began questioning whether some of the tank divisions reported in England actually existed. The intercepted messages showed analysts comparing different reports and finding inconsistencies. Within 48 hours, the 20 Committee had Garbo send a long message to his handlers explaining exactly why those inconsistencies existed. Different agents using different designation systems, units moving between observation periods, temporary reorganizations. The explanation was brilliantly crafted because the British knew exactly which inconsistencies had raised German concerns. The feedback machine allowed them to address doubts before those doubts could undermine the entire deception. The scale of information flowing through this system was staggering. Bletchley Park was processing thousands of decrypts daily. The 20 Committee was managing multiple double agents, sending hundreds of messages. Intelligence analysts were reading German assessments, identifying concerns, crafting responses, and deploying those responses through the appropriate channels. All of this had to happen quickly enough to maintain the illusion, while German interest remained active. By May of 1944, the feedback machine had produced measurable results. German intelligence estimated there were 510 Allied divisions in Britain. The actual number was 350. This was not a random error. It was a systematic overestimation produced by the feedback loop. Each false report of a new division would be confirmed by other double agents. The Germans would add that division to their order of battle. They would then look for further confirmation of its existence. The double agents, reading German requests through ultra-intercepts, would provide exactly the confirmation being sought. The false division would become real in German understanding. The beauty of this system was its self-reinforcing nature. The more the Germans believed the deceptions, the more they looked for information confirming those beliefs. The more they looked for confirmation, the more opportunities the double agents had to provide it. The feedback loop amplified the deception, turning small lies into enormous misperceptions. It was psychological manipulation refined to a science. There were moments when the system teetered on the edge of exposure. In March, a German intelligence officer in Paris sent a report questioning whether the build-up at southeast England was perhaps too obvious, suggesting it might be a deception. The intercepted message caused immediate concern at the 20 Committee. They responded by having several double agents report increased security measures around the FUSAG installations, explaining that the Allies were aware the Germans had detected the build-up and were now trying to conceal it. This meta-deception, a deception about the enemy detecting the deception, actually strengthened German belief that the phantom armies were real. The feedback machine also operated in reverse. The British used double agents to test what the Germans did not know. They would have agents send tentative inquiries about matters where British intelligence was uncertain of German understanding. The German responses, intercepted through Ultra, would reveal the gaps in German knowledge. These gaps could then be exploited. If the Germans did not know about certain Allied capabilities, those capabilities could be kept secret longer. If they overestimated certain threats, those misperceptions could be reinforced. As D-Day approached, the feedback machine reached its maximum intensity. Every day brought new decrypts showing German confidence in the Czech phantom armies. Every decrypt created opportunities for further deception. The Germans were now so thoroughly convinced of Allied strength at Calais that they were requesting their agents obtain specific details about invasion, timing, and tactics. The double agents, of course, provided exactly the information the Germans wanted to hear, all of it false. The intercepts revealed something even more valuable than German beliefs. They showed German force dispositions. The Germans were positioning their strongest units to defend against the phantom armies at Calais. They were holding reserves back from Normandy specifically because they believed the real invasion would come farther north. The feedback machine had not only created false beliefs, but had translated those beliefs into concrete military decisions that would determine the outcome of the invasion. On June 5th, the night before D-Day, The final intercepts showed German commanders confident in their defensive preparations. They knew an invasion was imminent. They had positioned their forces to repel it. They were ready for the attack that would never come to the place where they waited. The feedback machine had done its work. The Atlantic Wall's defenders were looking the wrong way, their attention fixed on phantom threats while real danger gathered 200 miles distant. The most sophisticated weapons system of the war was not a tank or a plane or a ship. It was a loop of deception and confirmation that had taught the enemy to believe lies more than truth, to see ghosts as real while missing the genuine army about to land on their shores. At 4:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the first Allied paratroopers landed in Normandy. By dawn, thousands of ships were approaching the beaches. By noon, over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore or fighting their way inland. The invasion had begun, and in that moment, Operation Bodyguard entered its most critical and most dangerous phase. Everything that had been built over 18 months of meticulous deception now had to survive contact with reality. The challenge was extraordinary. How do you maintain a lie when the truth is unfolding on beaches 200 miles away? How do you convince an enemy that what they are witnessing with their own eyes is not the real attack? How do you keep 19 German divisions frozen at Calais, waiting for an invasion that will never come, while Allied forces struggle to gain a foothold in Normandy? The answer lay in exploiting what the deception had already built into German thinking. For months, the double agents had been suggesting that the Allied invasion plan involved multiple landing sites. Normandy, they had hinted, might be used for a diversionary attack to draw German reserves away from the real invasion at Calais. This idea had been planted carefully, mentioned casually in several agents' reports, never emphasized, but always present. Now, as Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Germans had a framework already in place for understanding what they were seeing. At 7 o'clock on the morning of D-Day, even as troops were storming the beaches, German commanders were reading intelligence assessments that Normandy was likely a feint. The reports cited the continued presence of Patton's Phantom Army Group in southeast England. They noted that the landing force in Normandy, while substantial, was smaller than the forces supposedly waiting at Dover. They observed that the Allies had not committed their strongest units. All of this pointed, German intelligence concluded, to Normandy being a preliminary operation designed to draw German reserves southward before the main attack struck at Calais. Hitler himself embraced this interpretation with fatal conviction. At his headquarters in Berchtesgaden, receiving reports of the Normandy landings, he refused to release the panzer reserves stationed near Paris. These armoured divisions represented Germany's best chance to throw the Allies back into the sea while the beachhead was still vulnerable. But Hitler believed Normandy was a diversion. He believed Patton's forces were still waiting to invade. He believed the intelligence his services had been providing for months, and so he waited, holding back the reserves for 7 crucial hours, while Allied forces consolidated their positions. Those 7 hours changed the course of the war. By the time Hitler finally released the panzers, Allied forces had established a foothold that could not be dislodged. The tanks that might have overwhelmed the invasion in its first hours instead arrived too late, moving through bocage country where their advantages in armour and mobility were negated by terrain. The Atlantic Wall's defenders had the forces to repel the invasion, but those forces were in the wrong place at the wrong time, held back by a commander who believed in phantom armies. But the deception did not end with D-Day. In fact, its most remarkable phase was just beginning. The Allies needed to maintain German belief in the Calais invasion for as long as possible, ideally, until they could break out from Normandy and make the strategic situation clear. This meant the double agents had to continue their performances under conditions of extreme pressure. They had to explain why Patton had not yet attacked. They had to maintain the fiction that Normandy was a diversion. They had to do all of this while German commanders were actually fighting Allied forces and could compare intelligence reports against battlefield reality. Agent Garbo sent what may have been his masterpiece on the night of D-Day itself. After consulting with the 20 Committee, he transmitted an urgent message to his German handlers at 3 in the morning of June 7th. The message was long, detailed, and brilliantly crafted. He reported that his agents had just confirmed the presence of Patton's entire army group still in England. He noted that fewer than half of the Allied divisions believed to be in Britain had participated in the Normandy landing. He concluded with a dramatic warning. Normandy is a diversion, the main attack is still coming at Calais, and Germany must not weaken its defences there by sending reinforcements to Normandy. The Germans received this message with what can only be described as relief. Here was an explanation that made sense of what they were seeing. Here was confirmation from their most trusted source that their strategic assessment was correct. German High Command immediately circulated Garbo's message to field commanders with a priority classification. They were so convinced of its accuracy that they awarded Garbo the Iron Cross in absentia, one of the few times the decoration was given to a foreign agent. They never knew they were decorating a British intelligence operation. The deception teams now faced the challenge of sustaining the illusion day after day as Allied forces expanded the Normandy beachhead. They invented a series of explanations for why the Calais invasion kept not happening. Bad weather in the Channel was making the crossing too dangerous. Political disagreements between American and British commanders were delaying the operation. Supply problems were preventing the assault. Each excuse was used for a few days, then replaced with a new one as circumstances changed. The phantom armies in southeast England had to remain active. Radio traffic continued, suggesting ongoing preparations. The double agents reported seeing increased activity at Dover and surrounding areas. Reconnaissance aircraft were allowed to photograph the fake installations, which were carefully maintained to show continued occupation. Every element of the deception that had convinced the Germans before D-Day had to continue operating afterward. German commanders, desperate for clarity, sent increasingly urgent requests to their intelligence services. Is Normandy the main attack? Or not? Should we send reinforcements or hold them back? The intelligence services, relying on the double agents, consistently advised that Normandy was a diversion and Calais remained the primary threat. This advice was not coming from incompetent analysts. It was coming from capable intelligence officers who were making reasonable judgments based on information they believed to be reliable. The tragedy for Germany was that every source they trusted was controlled by the enemy. The strain on the double agents themselves was extraordinary. They were maintaining complex fictions under conditions where one mistake could expose everything. Agent Tricycle had to explain why he had not observed any major troop movements from southeast England toward embarkation ports. His response was that the movements were happening at night under strict secrecy, which actually increased German belief that a major operation was being prepared. Agent Brutus reported on continued air operations from bases in Kent, suggesting preparation for air support of a Calais landing. Every agent had to maintain their individual storyline while ensuring those stories supported the larger narrative. By June 15th, 9 days after D-Day, Allied forces had established a beachhead 60 miles wide and 15 miles deep. Nearly 500,000 troops were ashore, and still 19 German divisions remained at Calais, waiting for Patton. The 15th Army, which could have turned the tide in Normandy, stayed frozen in position, defending against ghosts while real battles raged miles away. The psychological pressure on German commanders was immense. They could see Allied success in Normandy. They could see their forces struggling to contain the beachhead. But their intelligence services kept insisting the main attack had not yet come. Some field commanders began requesting permission to move units toward Normandy regardless of intelligence assessments. But higher command, convinced by the deception, refused these requests. They had been taught to trust their intelligence services, and those services were telling them a consistent story from multiple independent sources. By late June, Some German officers were beginning to question the intelligence. They pointed out that 3 weeks had passed since D-Day with no sign of the Calais invasion. They noted that Allied forces in Normandy were too strong and too committed to be a mere diversion. But even these doubts were countered by the double agents, who reported that the Calais operation had been repeatedly postponed due to circumstances beyond Allied control but remained the primary invasion plan. The turning point came in mid-July, 40 days after D-Day, when American forces finally broke through German defences in Operation Cobra. The breakthrough made it unmistakably clear that Normandy was not a diversion, but a full-scale invasion aimed at liberating France. German commanders, seeing the strategic situation collapse, began moving forces from Calais toward the expanding beachhead. But they moved too late. The critical 6 weeks when those forces could have made a difference had passed while they waited for phantom armies. The 15th Army finally received orders to redeploy on July 20th. By then, the Allies had landed over 1 million troops in Normandy. The beachhead was unbreakable. The Atlantic Wall's most powerful defending force had spent 45 days positioned to repel an attack that never came, while the real invasion succeeded because they were not there to stop it. The double agents maintained their performances almost to the end. Even in late July, Garbo was sending messages explaining that the Calais invasion had been cancelled due to Allied success in Normandy, but that his information had been accurate at the time he reported it. He was protecting his credibility even as the deception came to an end, ensuring the Germans would never realize how thoroughly they had been manipulated. The cost of the deception to Germany was calculated by Allied intelligence after the war. The 19 divisions held at Calais represented approximately 250,000 troops and 1,500 tanks that were not available to defend Normandy during the critical first weeks of the invasion. Military analysts estimated that if even half of those forces had been positioned in Normandy on D-Day, the invasion would likely have failed. The beaches would have become killing grounds. The Atlantic Wall would have held. Instead, Hitler's most powerful defensive system was defeated by its own success in the wrong place. The concrete bunkers at Calais remained fully manned, their guns ready, their defenders waiting through June and July while the war was lost 200 miles away. The Atlantic Wall had not been broken. It had been bypassed through imagination, rendered irrelevant through creativity, defeated by making its guardians believe in armies that existed only as rubber and radio waves and lies. For 50 days, the greatest military deception in history sustained itself against reality, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys walls, but the one that makes defenders look away, while those walls are simply walked around. In the years following D-Day, military analysts around the world studied Operation Bodyguard with the intensity usually reserved for revolutionary technologies. What had been accomplished was not merely a successful tactical deception, but something far more significant: the creation of an entirely new form of warfare. The principles discovered through trial and error in the fields of England and the basements of London became formulas, doctrines, mathematical relationships that are still classified today. Strategic deception had become a science. The first principle to emerge from analysis was what became known as the rule of 3 sources. British intelligence had discovered through their feedback loop with Ultra that German analysts required independent confirmation from multiple sources before accepting intelligence as actionable. Through careful measurement, they determined the precise threshold, 2.3 sources on average. Round that up, and you arrive at 3. Any critical deception needed confirmation from at least 3 supposedly independent channels. This was not intuition or guesswork. It was a measured psychological constant, as reliable as any law of physics. Modern intelligence services still use this principle. When attempting to plant false information with an adversary, they ensure it comes through multiple channels that appear unconnected. The channels might be signals intelligence, human sources, and overhead imagery, each providing pieces that form a consistent picture. The adversary, seeing confirmation from multiple independent methodologies, accepts the information as reliable. They never suspect that all three channels are controlled by the same deception operation. The second principle concerned the ratio of truth to lies. The British discovered that deception worked best when embedded in a matrix of accurate information. Through systematic testing via the double agents, they found that approximately 70% of the information provided needed to be verifiable truth. The 30% that was false would then be accepted because it came from sources that had proven reliable. This ratio became known as the bodyguard ratio, and it remains classified in most Western militaries because it continues to be operationally useful. Think about what this means. Effective deception is not about lying constantly. It is about building credibility through mostly accurate reporting and then leveraging that credibility for crucial falsehoods. Agent Garbo sent 7,900 messages to German intelligence. Approximately 5,500 of them contained accurate information about British military activities. The remaining 2,400 contained the lies that shaped German strategy, but those lies were believed because they came wrapped in truth. The third principle addressed how deception should be delivered. The British discovered that intelligence enemy discovers for themselves is far more credible than intelligence that is obviously presented to them. German reconnaissance flights were allowed to photograph the phantom armies. German listening posts were permitted to intercept the radio traffic. German agents were enabled to observe the fake installations. The Germans never suspected that everything they were discovering was deliberately being shown to them. They believed they were stealing secrets when in fact they were being fed a carefully prepared script. This principle of allowing discovery rather than presentation has become fundamental to modern deception operations. During Desert Storm in 1991, American forces wanted Iraq to believe an amphibious assault was planned against Kuwait City. Rather than simply announcing this through captured agents, they positioned Marines aboard ships where Iraqi reconnaissance would see them, conducted practice landings that Iraqi radar would detect, and generated radio traffic that Iraqi signals intelligence would intercept. Iraq discovered the amphibious threat through their own intelligence gathering, and therefore believed it completely. They positioned significant forces to defend against an assault that never came, exactly as the Germans had done at Calais. The fourth principle involved what intelligence officers call cognitive load, or information overload. The British discovered that German intelligence could be overwhelmed by providing too much information to process effectively. The phantom armies generated such volumes of radio traffic, created so many visual targets for reconnaissance, and produced such detailed reports through the double agents that German analysts struggled to evaluate it all. In that confusion, false information slipped through because analysts lacked the time and resources to verify everything. Modern cyber warfare operations use this same principle. An adversary's security systems are flooded with traffic, making it difficult to distinguish genuine threats from false alarms. Intelligence services are given so much data to process that they miss the critical signals hidden in the noise. The principle remains: overwhelm the enemy's ability to analyze, and deception becomes easier. The mathematics of the deception were eventually reduced to formulas. How many fake units are needed to convince an enemy that a threat exists in a given location? How many radio transmissions must be generated to simulate a division? How many visual signatures must be created? These questions received numerical answers based on measurement of German responses. The formulas remain classified, but their existence represents the transformation of deception from art to engineering. After the war, these principles were incorporated into military doctrine worldwide. The American Army established dedicated deception units, trained in the techniques pioneered during Bodyguard. The Soviet Union, learning of the operation's success through espionage, created their own Maskirovka doctrine that emphasized deception at every level of military operations. Even small nations with limited resources studied how creativity and intelligence could multiply force effectiveness without requiring expensive weapons systems. The Vietnam War saw extensive use of bodyguard principles. American forces created phantom landing zones in remote areas, generating helicopter traffic and radio transmissions to suggest major operations. North Vietnamese forces would concentrate to defend against these phantom threats while actual operations occurred elsewhere. The deceptions were smaller in scale than D-Day, but based on identical principles: multiple confirmation sources, embedded truth, allowed discovery, and information overload. The Israeli military became perhaps the most sophisticated practitioners of strategic deception. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egyptian forces used bodyguard-inspired deceptions to disguise their invasion preparations. They conducted training exercises that Israeli intelligence monitored, making the exercises seem routine when they were actually invasion rehearsals. They maintained radio traffic suggesting units were still in garrison when those units had already moved to assault positions. The deception succeeded brilliantly, achieving surprise despite Israeli intelligence capabilities. Modern militaries now teach bodyguard principles at every service academy. Officers study the phantom armies, the double agents, the feedback machine. They analyze what worked and why, extracting lessons that apply to contemporary warfare. The mathematical models developed from the operation inform computer simulations that test deception effectiveness before resources are committed. What began as an improvised response to an impossible problem has become a core component of military planning. The digital age has created new opportunities for bodyguard-style deceptions. Cyber operations can generate false electromagnetic signatures, create fake communications networks, and produce synthetic intelligence that enemy collection systems will discover. The principles remain constant even as the technologies change. Multiple sources, embedded truth, allowed discovery, cognitive overload. These concepts work as effectively in cyberspace as they did in the fields of England in 1944. Intelligence services study the psychological aspects of bodyguard with particular intensity. How do you make an enemy believe something they are predisposed to accept? How do you reinforce existing biases? How do you build confirmation bias into an adversary's analytical process? These questions touch on fundamental aspects of human cognition, and the answers discovered during World War II continue to shape how nations conduct intelligence operations. The ethical implications of strategic deception have been debated since bodyguard's success became public. Some argue that deception in warfare is morally no different from any other tactic that saves lives by achieving victory more efficiently. Others worry about a world where truth itself becomes weaponized, where nations become so skilled at deception that nothing can be trusted. These debates continue in intelligence and military ethics courses, with bodyguards serving as the primary case study. What remains undeniable is that Operation Bodyguard changed warfare fundamentally. Before June 1944, deception was considered a minor tactical tool, useful for small-scale operations but not decisive at strategic levels. After Normandy, every military planner understood that imagination could defeat steel, that creativity could render concrete irrelevant, that the right lie told the right way could be more powerful than divisions of troops. The Atlantic Wall was defeated not just by the phantom armies that drew defenders away, but by proving that a new form of warfare was possible. The lessons learned in those 18 months of preparation continue to shape how nations fight, how they spy, and how they understand the relationship between truth and victory. The science of strategic deception, born from necessity in Churchill's war rooms, remains one of the most powerful and least understood forces in modern conflict. The Atlantic Wall still stands in places. You can visit sections of it today, walk through the concrete bunkers, see the gun emplacements that once pointed toward the sea, touch the walls that were meant to make invasion impossible. The concrete is as thick as it ever was, the engineering as impressive, the vision as ambitious. But these ruins stand as monuments not to the defensive success, but to a more profound truth: that imagination can defeat steel, that creativity can render fortifications irrelevant, that the human mind remains the most powerful weapon ever devised. Consider what was accomplished with rubber and radio waves. The Atlantic Wall consumed 10% of Nazi Germany's entire war economy, millions of tons of concrete, hundreds of thousands of workers laboring for years, engineering expertise that represented the pinnacle of defensive construction. It was designed by some of the finest military minds in Germany, built to specifications that seemed unassailable, defended by soldiers who believed it could not be breached. Against this massive investment in steel and concrete, the Allies deployed inflatable tanks, wooden airplanes, and lies. The cost of the deception was less than a single bomber squadron. The return was victory. The numbers tell a story almost too remarkable to believe. 30,000 inflatable tanks that could be packed into duffel bags defeated actual panzer divisions. Wooden aircraft that took hours to construct neutralized real Luftwaffe squadrons. Radio operators working 18-hour shifts immobilized hundreds of thousands of troops. 27 double agents, every one of them controlled by British intelligence, rendered Germany's entire intelligence service worse than useless. The Phantom armies cost perhaps £1 million to create and maintain. The Atlantic Wall cost billions, yet the Phantoms won. Think about the lives saved through this deception. Initial estimates suggested 750,000 Allied casualties in the first week of a direct assault on a fully defended coastline. The actual casualties from the Normandy invasion were terrible enough, approximately 10,000 dead on D-Day itself, and many more in the weeks that followed. But that carnage would have been multiplied many times over if German defences had been concentrated where the Allies actually landed. Military historians estimate the deception saved approximately 117,000 Allied lives by drawing German forces to Calais while the invasion came at Normandy. But the impact extended beyond casualties. The successful deception shortened the war itself. By securing a beachhead in France in June of 1944, the Allies began the liberation of Western Europe 6 months earlier than would have been possible if the invasion had failed and required replanning. 6 months of shortened war meant 6 months less time for Hitler's regime to murder Jews in concentration camps, 6 months less destruction of European cities, 6 months fewer casualties among civilians and soldiers alike. The Phantom armies did not just save the lives of those who would have died on beaches, they saved countless others by hastening the end of the war itself. The human stories behind the deception carry their own power. Juan Pujol Garcia, the failed chicken farmer and novelist who became Agent Garbo, survived the war to receive decorations from both Britain and Germany, the only person in history to be honoured by both sides of the conflict. After the war, he faked his own death and lived quietly in Venezuela, his role in the deception remaining secret for decades. When historians finally found him in the 1980s, he was an elderly man living in obscurity, the person who had perhaps done more than any other individual to ensure D-Day's success, unknown to the world he had helped save. The radio operators who worked 18-hour shifts, sending fake messages, returned to civilian life and never spoke of what they had done. The Hollywood set designers who built Phantom armies went back to creating illusions for entertainment rather than war. The intelligence officers of the 20 Committee returned to academic posts and peacetime careers, carrying secrets they could not share even with their families. For decades, the full scope of Operation Bodyguard remained classified, known only to those who had participated and sworn to silence. When the story finally became public in the 1970s, it changed how people understood warfare. The revelation that imagination had defeated the Atlantic Wall, that creativity had proven more powerful than concrete, inspired military planners, but also artists, entrepreneurs, and anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges, the lesson transcended military application. Sometimes the solution to an overwhelming problem is not to attack it directly, but to make those defending it look the wrong way while you find another path entirely. Military colleges worldwide now teach Operation Bodyguard as the most successful deception in history. Officers study every aspect: how the phantom armies were constructed, how the double agents were managed, how the feedback loop with Ultra allowed real-time adjustment of deceptions, how the Germans were taught to believe lies more than truth. But the deeper lesson is about the nature of power itself. The most formidable seeming defenses can be rendered useless if the defenders are convinced the threat lies elsewhere. Strength positioned in the wrong place is weakness. Force concentrated against phantoms is force wasted. The operation also demonstrated the power of coordination and secrecy on a massive scale. 23,000 people were involved in preparing for D-Day. Every one of them knew the invasion was coming, yet virtually none of them knew where or when, and that secret was maintained despite German intelligence's desperate efforts to discover it. At the same time, the deception operation required hundreds of people actively spreading false information, each playing their part in a script so complex that consistency across all elements required weekly coordination meetings and constant attention to detail. The ability to maintain both absolute secrecy about the truth and perfect coordination about the lies represented an organizational achievement as impressive as the deception itself. The Atlantic Wall's defeat vindicated a particular vision of warfare, one that values intelligence and creativity as much as firepower and armor. During the planning debates for D-Day, some commanders had argued for a direct assault relying on overwhelming force. Others advocated for the deception approach, accepting that it was riskier but potentially far more effective. The success of Bodyguard proved that investing in intelligence, deception, and psychological operations could yield returns far exceeding the cost of additional divisions or bombers. Modern militaries have internalized this lesson, devoting substantial resources to capabilities that manipulate enemy perceptions rather than simply destroying enemy forces. Yet there remains something almost tragic about the German perspective. They were not fools. Their intelligence officers were capable, educated, dedicated professionals. Their commanders were experienced soldiers who had won victories across Europe. They had access to substantial resources for gathering information. They simply never imagined that every single one of their sources in Britain had been compromised, that their entire intelligence picture was a fabrication, that they were being fed a story so consistent and so detailed that it seemed impossible to be false. They believed what seemed believable, and that belief destroyed them. The Atlantic Wall stands today as a reminder of a truth older than warfare itself, that perception shapes reality more than reality shapes perception. The wall was real. Its strength was genuine. Its defenders were brave and competent. But none of that mattered because the defenders believed the invasion would come at Calais. Their belief, based on intelligence they trusted from sources they had validated, was more powerful than concrete. The wall could not save them from their own certainty. In the end, Operation Bodyguard succeeded because it exploited something fundamental about how human beings process information. We look for patterns. We seek confirmation of what we already believe. We trust sources that have proven reliable. We accept intelligence that fits our expectations and question intelligence that contradicts them. The deception worked not because the Germans were incompetent, but because they were human, subject to the same cognitive biases that affect all of us. The British simply understood those biases better and exploited them with unprecedented skill. The phantom armies of 1944 have dissolved back into history. The inflatable tanks have deflated, the wooden planes have rotted, the radio transmissions have faded into silence. But what they accomplished remains. They proved that in warfare, as in nature, the most powerful force is not always the most visible. Sometimes strength lies in subtlety, victory comes through misdirection, and the greatest triumphs are achieved by making the enemy defeat themselves through belief in carefully constructed lies. The Atlantic Wall was meant to be Hitler's guarantee against invasion, an engineering marvel that would make Western Europe a fortress. Instead, it became the stage for the greatest magic trick in military history, a demonstration that no wall can defend against an enemy who understands that the real battle is not against concrete, but against the minds of those who believe the concrete will save them. In the fields of England, where rubber tanks once stood in phantom formation, in the bunkers at Calais where German soldiers waited for armies that never came, in the beaches of Normandy where the real invasion succeeded because defenders looked elsewhere, the lesson of Operation Bodyguard endures, that imagination defeats steel, that creativity triumphs over concrete, and that sometimes the most impossible victories are won by fighting battles that never happen against armies that never existed.